I'm Deidre Berger. I'm director of the AJC Berlin Raymer Institute for German Jewish Relations. Thank you for staying with us. You're being a terrific audience, I must say. It's not easy to make this much time available, and we appreciate it because it's so important. It's not an easy act to follow David Harris.
That's right.
You put us in a not-so-easy situation. But on the other hand, you gave us the message that we need to carry through, which is the call to action, what's happening on a government level. We've heard from civil society, from different sectors of civil society this morning, and now we have the opportunity, and it's really a great opportunity, to have with us three of the people who at the moment are the most present globally, really, on dealing specifically with issues of anti-Semitism. We're very pleased to have with us Gilles Clavreux, who was appointed in mid-December by the French government, by the Prime Minister, as the interministerial delegate on racism and anti-Semitism. It's the first time that such a position has existed, if I understand correctly. And Gilles comes to it from extensive work with the Interior Ministry and with domestic issues at the Prime Minister's office. We have Felix Klein, Ambassador Felix Klein, who is the special representative of the German Foreign Office for relations with Jewish organizations and anti-Semitism. He's the third person to hold this position, which began after the 2004 OSCE conference in Berlin, when the German government recognized the importance of this outreach. And he's been extremely active since he began last year, in last March?
Last March.
Yeah, last March in his position. And we have Ira Foreman, who is the special envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism for the U.S. State Department. I haven't counted what number you are. You're the fourth? Third. Also the third. Okay. Good things happen in threes. To deal with his issue, and through this office, he's been able to create a lot of awareness and raise attention to the very pressing issues that we've had even since he's entered office, sadly. I think we don't need to go into great detail to say that the European Jewish community is deeply shaken, and the world Jewish community, by Toulouse, Burgos, Brussels, Paris, Copenhagen. It's a list of terrorist attacks. There have been attacks since the 60s, but these many attacks against Jewish communities in such a short period of time has indeed opened a lot of questions for the Jewish world, compounded by the demonstrations last summer on streets of major cities throughout Europe. There were different responses, but we know that in many cases these demonstrations spilled over into direct anti-Semitic rhetoric, slogans, aggressiveness. There was violence at these demonstrations. People were attacked who were pro-Israel, not necessarily Jewish, including a member of the German parliament. What's happened in the wake of this the last 2 or 3 years? Sadly, not much. Not much has happened at a European level or at a national level. We've had some excellent speeches, as David said, by top leaders of the countries represented here and more. And that's important. This didn't happen in 2000, 2002, David, when you were in Europe and were concerned about the first wave of anti-Semitism in the wake of the Second Intifada. This is progress. This is important. And we can only encourage everyone here to have your leaders continue to speak out. But it's not enough. It's not enough at all. We need concrete action. We need delegates like the ones here focusing on this issue. We need it at an EU level. We need it at national levels. Before I ask everyone to speak, let me just quickly refer to the call to action, because we at AJC have spent a lot of time working on these issues. Many of you know me. You know my colleagues. You know that we've been working on this, as David says, our great Europhile, for decades, in fact, and really since 2000. We have concentrated energies here. Many of you also know Andy Baker, who moderated the previous panel, who's now the special representative for the OSCE chairman in office on anti-Semitism, a recognition of the ways in which we think through these things. There's many aspects to this plan. In terms of government, just to summarize briefly, we're calling for a comprehensive plan of action. We're calling for governments to provide adequate security, to create centralized coordination at a national level. We'll hear in a moment about that. For more parliamentary involvement, not just the leaders. We need parliaments to speak out and take action. We need much better data collection from governments, precise data on anti-Semitism, and we need the governments don't hide behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as we've heard a number of times here. It's not acceptable when the Berlin government creates a new category, Israel-Palestinian conflict, which is what they did last year, and simply took those incidents out of their register of anti-Semitism. No, this is not acceptable. And we need educational initiatives and social media initiatives, as David Harris spoke eloquently about the challenges of those initiatives. What is an educational initiative? In Germany, we have tremendous disputes at the moment amongst those NGOs dealing with anti-Semitism. To what degree do we deal with issues of general racism, and where does the specificity of anti-Semitism come in? We don't know many of the answers yet, by the way. That's why we need to start now. And hopefully we have some people with us who will give us some answers of where beginnings are and what we can do to push to expand that. First, I'd like to ask our panelists to each explain briefly in France, in Germany, what's being done, what's changed in the last 2 years in response to events in Europe. And Ira Foreman, who is in Europe extensively, will also talk about what he's seeing about what's being done. So first I'd like to ask Jill.
Thank you, Jada. David, while listening to your powerful speech, I was thinking to myself, though you had some tough words, but I'll come on that, for what was the situation 15 years ago. As I started my career and remembered quite well the miscomprehensions, which were terribly unsettling for me, I was thinking these words you used could have been in the mouth of a French leader today, word by word. There is nothing, not a word, not a single word I would not use myself to describe the situation, to describe what is at stake, and to describe what we need to do collectively to face the situation. So thank you for that, and thank you for inviting me. I was I was by the president's office before having this designation as an interministerial delegate, and I want to make this little comeback to say my aim was security by and large, and that involved counter-terrorism at the time when we saw this multiplication by 2 or 4 of people moving to Syria and coming back with the intentions we know. And on the other hand, we had in this year, 2014, these demonstrations in Paris, in Sarcelles, elsewhere, with a quite new mix of people coming from far left, from far right, from radical Islam, and all of them shouting out their hate of republic, of democratic values, and of the Jews, like if it were like something, a remnant thing in history, that when it comes to rising extremism, as it's been very well said a few minutes ago, Jews and also Republican and democratic values are in the middle of the target. And so we had this sense of emergency in face of this situation, and thought that this feeling we had was not really shared among the French society to be true. And that we were not so many mourning the victims of Toulouse, mourning Elana Khanemi, mourning the rape and denouncing the rape of a young girl in Créteil, along with his companion, threatened by a gun probably because they were Jews. Money was inside somewhere in the flat. So that was only a few weeks, before the attacks in January. But we had that clear conscience, and in fact, there were 3 times in this 15-year-old history. The time you said in 2000, with this role of Cassandra, there's another quote I would like to mention from Chaim Korsia, who often recalls that the Jews are called the sentinels of the Republic in France. Sentinels, preventing from danger. And the second time was when political leaders, some of them in France, not only in France, but in France, stand up to say there is something going on here and we can't accept it. And the third time must be now, must be mobilizing wide in the civil society, not only the institutional system, not only political leaders, not only, I would say, the so-called elites, association, intellectuals, but much more to go on the field, to go on the ground, to go in the small towns, in big towns, where things happen now because phenomena of anti-Semitism, of radicalization are not yet confined in some deprived suburbs. That's over. That's an old story now. It's widespread. It's everywhere. It's even in the middle class suburbs. It's not only in France. It's in Europe. It's not only in Europe, actually. So we had that feeling that we had to take pretty new steps and to change the speed, the intensity, the width of our ambition to fight against racism and anti-Semitism, not only against some forms ancient from far right and new forms from Islamic and from leftist movements, but also to fight against this prejudice, because when you had these political leaders 15 years ago saying, no, you don't understand French model, you can't disconnect that from the fact that today, in today's France, 37% out of the population thinks that the Jews, they have too much power and they have peculiar relationships with money. So, okay, here they come again, making too much of things as usual. We know things better than they do. This has to deal with prejudice, and prejudice prevents you from seeing the truth. And the start of my work at the mid-December was setting up a proper picture of the reality of the threat we are facing. And second thing was to define the main axis on which we were about to work. First was obvious, it was security. So things have been implemented, of course, in a very, very wide way after the attacks, with a 10,000 soldier strong plan to protect all the places of worship, all the schools of the Jewish community. And this level, this intensity in the protection will remain, as François Hollande recalled it a few days ago, as long as it will be necessary, with all the complements, technically, private, and so that we can find. But we know that as long as we have this level of threat, we will have this level of security. That's the first thing. It's responding immediately to a threat, even though it's not, as Ron said it very well. If it's somewhat unsettling to live in these conditions, it's better living in these conditions than living with immediate fear and danger. But of course, that was not enough, and our ambition was to build a comprehensive plan involving all the dimensions of public action. So not only security, but also education, internet regulation, better sanction, and the probably most important thing, mobilizing the civil society, the local bodies in the territories, the associations, cultural institutions, and so on and so. So there were intense work, and it wouldn't have been possible without the full involvement of the higher level in the state. So I had permanent and personal interactions with the Minister of Interior, with the Minister of Justice, with the Minister of Education, and it's often said that in France too many things come from the top. That's true, but if nothing comes from the top, nothing happens. So on the other hand, that's not too bad. I had this, this top input at the beginning of it, and we finally, in a 3 months' time, with constant relationships with all associations, with Simone, whom I thank for great help and great consideration to the work we tried to do. We built a 40 action and 100 million euro plan involving dealing with education, as I said, and it's not only, as you said, David, not only saying we have to learn the Shoah, is we have to do it effectively, we have to do many other things, we have to do it cleverly, because the point is not writing good fact sheets and then leaving teachers on their own. So we will have, by the month of June, 300,000 French teachers trained for teaching on universal values, citizenship, tolerance, sorry for the word, and all these things that are so simple when you're a grown-up, well-educated adult, but so difficult to make share and to make understand in this so complex world we live in today. So that's education in the school, out of the school also, with memory places, culture, with sports, which is a very, very important field to share values, but also to prevent from communitarian, radical attempts to grab young and weak children and youth. We have a very important axis on internet regulation, which is today an open field to hatred. So we'll create a special unit by the Ministry of the Interior to fight against hatred on the internet, blocking the sites, prosecuting the hate speech speakers. We also will have tough discussions, and you trust me, they are tough, with internet platforms, so to give a binding roadmap on what they have to do, what they have to show on their sites, and the human resources they have to put behind the screens to drop off everything that has nothing to do on the social media. And we also want to have an effective, once again, I insist on that word, because principles are very good, but if they remain principles, they are even worse than doing nothing. Effective sanction on the judicial system. We have, as of now, a very low rate of condemnations in front of the justice. It's like a 300 a year for all racist acts and offenses and speeches. And it's been very, very stable from year to year, so which would mean that it's both stable and weak. It's of course not true. It's rising, and it's very frightening. And last thing, we also want, because sanction is one thing, educating is one thing, we also insist on partnership and sponsorship towards the people, the young people in the suburb who want to become true, effective, plain citizen. Because once again, teaching values doesn't go under only abstract principle, but with human relationships. And we want citizens to be involved, to take care of these children effectively, and to spend time with them, to teach them values, to help them finding jobs, finding internships, because these are the concrete difficulties of the real life. And that's what we aim to do also. The very idea, the core idea of it is very simple. Take care of your neighbor, take care of your brother. That's the sense of the Bible message also, if I'm not wrong. It's been said yesterday very, very often, Europe is at a turn point. It's not only Europe. It's not only France. It's a world problem. Radical Islam is not a problem of France, neither of Europe. Violence is not a problem of France, neither of Europe. It's a world's problem. So we need everybody to be in the board to help us and to help each other fighting against this cancer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very impressive set of an ambitious plan that you've put together. The situation in each country is, of course, different. There's not a cohesive action plan, I think, in Germany, but there have been a number of measures in the last few years.
Mm-hmm. Well, I represent the government of the country actually that invented the Shoah. This is a fact we always have to envisage, and we are reminded of that fact, particularly these days as we see the commemoration ceremonies marking the end of World War II. And it is exactly like you said, David, in your powerful speech, in these commemorating ceremonies, what's the main message of that? Of course, it's mourning and commemorating and honoring the victims, but at the same time, of course, seeing what can we do today of the situation. And it's being German, it's really hard to accept that even 70 years after the Shoah and in this country, there still exists anti-Semitism. Something which is really hard to accept, and of course we have to do something about that very firmly. First of all, repression. Many things have been said. Of course, we have to ensure the security of Jewish institutions all over the country. But at the same time, of course, we have to do many things in preventive work, and we are in the happy situation, though, that our politicians, our leaders in Germany, they have understood very well that activities have to be carried out. I thank you very much that you mentioned Angela Merkel. She is very sensitive. Also, Mr. Steinmeier. So whenever something has to be said publicly, they do it now. It's true. 15 years ago, maybe it wasn't so obvious that. Things that our politicians have done something in that respect so strongly. I remember last summer when we had this Israel-Gaza operation. Immediately, also with the support of AJC, we had the common statement of the foreign ministers of France, Italy, and Germany, absolutely condemning this Israel criticism. And this is something. Maybe on the international level, we could always should try to establish a mechanism. I mean, there's nothing against criticizing Israel. There are many things our government doesn't like, but it comes to a point of not acceptable criticism when Israel is criticized as an entity which doesn't have a right to exist, or which is not criticized as another Western country, like let's say the United States, when we don't like what the NSA things have been, the activities have been doing. So why there's a certain borderline, and we should establish an international mechanism of there's a no-go area where Israel is criticized as an entity which is a kind of monster and doesn't have a right to exist. So that's the first thing, and I'm very happy that our politicians have understood that. In Germany, we are in the situation that still 90% of anti-Semitic attacks are still committed by the old right-wing Nazi, people, which in a way, as you said, David, in your speech, is easy for our politicians to react. It has always been like this. I mean, we need to send police investigations. That's that's a mechanism we know very well. We are much more afraid, though, of this new form of anti-Semitism, which has also come to Germany. It's a common European problem, as we have heard, from this radical Muslim side. And this is something we absolutely have to look at in detail. And this is where the federal government wants to concentrate, actually, on our prevention work. So with our educational projects and money, we focus on these groups. They, as you might know, we have many Muslims, mainly from Turkey, living in Germany, and the idea is we should reach them, organized young Muslim NGOs and people, or teachers, Turkish teachers who teach in German schools, to do something about combat of anti-Semitism. And the response is good. There are NGOs like the so-called Kreuzberger Initiative, as you know, so young Muslims who tell other Muslims not to hate the Jews and to do something very, so it's much more natural and very convincing, and projects like this are supported by the government. Another new idea, which is actually very new, is to organize an education of trainers who go to the big, not to only the big, but to many German firms like Volkswagen or you know, the iron, wherever, and steel and coal companies, where we have many Muslim workers, and to go directly to the sites of the of production sites and to train them, to teach them about Israel, about the kind of common projects we have to say to do something about or against prejudices against Jews. That is important. And this is a very new project. We do this via the Jewish museums we have. They have been established in the last years, and it's a program which works very well. If you know, in the break of a production site where you have many Turkish or Palestinian workers, let's talk about the Jews and Israel. And I'm very optimistic about this new form of program. Because what is also a very nice and positive development in our country, we have Jews coming from Israel, the United States, but also other countries coming to Germany and want to live at least a certain time in our country. And this is fantastic, something unbelievable. I think also 15 years ago it would have been unbelievable. We have 25,000 Jews only in Berlin, more or less. And they enrich our culture, our life, and it's also a good task to tell the general German public, that Jewish life enriches us all. It's part of our history, it's part of our culture, and these positive examples we have to foster. So, for now.
Thank you very much. Ira, you've traveled quite a bit of Europe, of the world. It's not just a European problem. Looking at initiatives to fight anti-Semitism, responses from government, are there several that stand out in your mind that you've seen that you could perhaps share with us?
Sure. Well, first, I want to thank AJC, David, Deidre, for inviting me here. It's kind of my standard practice in speeches to say not just AJC, but the whole panoply of nonprofits, primarily the Jewish nonprofits in the United States, have been tremendous help to our office in getting us up to speed. We have new envoys every few years, and so each of those envoys need that help and that expertise. And what AJC in particular has in Europe is really unbelievable. The expertise of the people you guys have is really tremendous for me. And it's rare that a couple weeks go by that I don't call up Andy Baker and saying, Andy, what's going on here? So I do appreciate that. Dieter asked me to talk a little bit about kind of best practices and perhaps a few bad practices that we've seen. I want to start by saying I think it's important for us to, from the U.S., to address this with some degree of humility. We don't have all the answers. I'm hearing on this panel, no, even in Europe, we don't have all the answers. We certainly don't. I've been doing this job about 23 months, and places like Brussels and Paris I've been 4 or 5 times, and that does not make me an expert at all on a lot of these issues. So I don't want to beat our chests, even when our record sometimes seems better. One of the things we see, and I note upon every visit, is the complexity of this problem. And every country is different. And some of our record in the United States is based on some of just the accidents of history, the type of immigration we have, which partly our immigration policy. We have a different Muslim community than we find in most of Europe. But I also find that every single country I go to, the nature of anti-Semitism is different. You can't go, you can read the Frost survey and see, David mentioned Jews thinking of emigrating from their home country. The number in Hungary in 2012, when that Frost survey was taken, I believe, was 48%. In France, 46%. If you didn't know better, you'd think they'd have similar nature of anti-Semitism. And I find that nothing could be further from the truth. So there aren't cookie-cutter approaches that are going to work exactly the same in every country. And finally, the government response is different. And very different, and I'm always struck by that. One final note of humility. I have been 3 weeks almost straight on the road and just got in from an overnight flight from D.C., and I've never been so grateful for Belgian coffee, because I feel like I might be able to string a few sentences together, and a few minutes ago I didn't feel that way. So let me just say, best practices. I don't think I've ever been as impressed as a meeting I had outside of Paris, where Gilles and another of his colleagues sat on a panel with us, with me in front of the French consistoire, in which the description of what was being done on the interministerial level in France and the depth of the cooperation in deciding plans for both the long-term plan that Gilles brought today, but also the security plan, how much the Jewish community was being consulted, how much these plans were being done in almost partnership. I think that, and especially in contrast to what I've seen in some other countries, is really something to be remarked upon, and France has some should have some pride in this, working collaboratively with the Jewish community. I rarely talk to French Jewish leaders that I don't hear praise for what the government has done, not just in this arena, but in the last year with both the crisis in the summer with the riots in the streets, as well as with Charlie Hebdo and the kosher market. The second piece that I want to note in terms of best practices is the willingness of national leadership to speak up. I see that, and we've talked about that already. For the French Jewish leadership, French national leadership, especially when you look at 15, 20 years ago, for the willingness to speak up, address the problem as it is, denounce the problem consistently, is really praiseworthy. And of course, it's not just France. We've heard about the foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Italy. We've seen Angela Merkel speak up and lead rallies. This is absolutely essential. And again, compared to other countries, very praiseworthy. Thirdly, this also means, I think most importantly, having national leadership speak up is an absolutely necessary but far from sufficient response. If I learned anything from French Jewry, is both the appreciation of government but the fear that civil society is not stepping up to the plate. And that without that civil society, this problem is not adequately addressed. I'll go back to the United States for a second here. Clearly, one of the biggest differences between the United States' approach on this and Europe is the idea of censorship and First Amendment rights. We can argue all day back and forth on this, but I do think one practice we have in the United States that I'd like to see more of it in Europe is this social pressure that we have. Of course, you can say almost anything heinous, whether about Jews, African Americans, whatever minority you wish in the United States, and not be prosecuted. But there's tremendous social pressure on you. So if you want to be a credible credible voice in U.S. society, to say something anti-Semitic, to say something racist, is just the end of your credibility. Because it's not just government leaders that are going to go after you. It's going to be civil society. It's going to be clergy. It's going to be communal leaders, heads of nonprofits, heads of businesses are just going to call you out. And I wish we could have more of that in Europe as well. We can talk about that a little bit later. Finally, the speaking out, not just in general about anti-Semitism, but we've heard already about this idea of attacking Israel, and that is an acceptable form of anti-Semitism. I would really hope, and we see some of this with German leaders, French leaders, that we recognize that, yes, Israel can be criticized. But when that's delegitimizing Israel, when it's defaming Israel, fine to criticize Israel for numerous points, but to say what Israel does to the Palestinians is what the Nazis did to the Jews is clear defamation and clear anti-Semitism. Basically, treating Israel with a double standard needs to be recognized on the continent, as well as we recognize those 3 Ds in U.S. foreign policy as where legitimate criticism of Israel crosses the line to anti-Semitism. Let me just end by a few bad practices. In the last few weeks, we've seen historical revisionism. Yes, just teaching the Holocaust in and of itself is not necessarily a tool against anti-Semitism. But we've also seen in the last few weeks, I've seen, this whole argument of people saying, well, it was all about the Germans. There was no other responsibility. I've seen it in at least a couple countries publicly. Totally unacceptable. Yes, the lion's share of what the Holocaust was about in occupied Europe was with the German Nazi regime, and the way German diplomats handle that today is exemplary. The way it's handled in France, I gather, is exemplary, and it wasn't always so. Recognizing complicity, historical complicity, by all of us. The United States' hands are not totally clean either in this, even though we weren't in occupied Europe, is, I believe, an absolute essential first step in dealing with modern anti-Semitism on the continent today. I've also seen blame the messenger. I was in a country where riots were taking place last summer, and I talked to someone who was supposed to be responsible for combating hate speech, hate crime, who told me, well, the Jews of our country just complain too much. How that's different from what we have on the diplomats on the panel is striking.
Ira, thank you so much also for bringing in this important area of historical responsibility. As David said, memorials are great, but how do we make them relevant to young people today? And there's also a lot of competing narratives going on in large swaths of Central and Eastern Europe, people who experience communism, who experience 2 dictatorships. How can we acknowledge suffering and yet not equate the two? It's a big challenge. We have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll do a last round here. Sabina?
Yes, you have mentioned the need for distinguishing between legitimate criticism.
Wait, it's not on somewhere. No? Okay. Okay. Yeah. No?
Oh, I can speak up.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can.
Super.
Maybe you can hear me. You have mentioned the need for distinguishing between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism. And there was a definition of anti-Semitism which has disappeared from the official website. And Deidre remembers that when we were in Berlin in November at the civil society part of the conference on anti-Semitism of OECD, we have recommended that this definition be reintroduced. And the Basel resolution, which was taken in December at the interministerial conference, or what the exact name is, in fact took over many of our recommendations, but not this one. And obviously this is a political issue, and there must have been a disagreement on where to draw this line. Now my question to all of you is, do you believe that there is some way to reintroduce some consensus on where this borderline should be, or is this something that is left to the individual appreciation of the different bodies who have to deal with it?
Thank you, Sabina. For those who aren't aware of it, it was the so-called EUMC working definition on anti-Semitism, which the Fundamental Rights Agency has taken off its website, saying that it's not a definition-setting agency. And there's a lot of interest in getting it back on somewhere.
So, unfortunately, Mrs. Mona Sahlin couldn't be here. She was appointed National Coordinator Against Violent Extremism by the Swedish government. And she told me a couple of months ago that she knows that she is right when the far left threatened her because they don't want to be mixed with the right wings. And the right wings are upset being, with the Islamists. So these three groups who are violent extremists, so she's right. And for personal reasons, she couldn't be here. She conveys her apologies. I have one question, and that deals. It has been touched here, but I feel that we are not getting completely down to the core of the social medias, especially the hatred being spread via internet. Why is nothing happening? If there would have been, and when there are child pornography being spread via internet, the sites are closed down as we speak. But this is not happening when the hatred is spread, anti-Semitic hatred and other kinds of hatred. So my question is, why not?
Okay, thank you. So we have one more question. Is there one more? No.
Yes.
Yes, sorry.
Hello, I'm Jane Brain-Goulet. I'm the president of the European Union of Jewish Students. And my question goes to civil society. This is one of our biggest concerns as a youth civil society organization, and the sense of isolation in the combat on anti-Semitism. All three of you spoke about mobilizing civil society, and of course, changing the culture of civil society, especially in comparison to how civil society works in the US, is quite a challenge, and certainly also from a government point of view, difficult to set incentives. But I'd still be interested how you see your role in encouraging more alliances, more cooperation, and more solidarity amongst civil society.
Wonderful. Three very good questions. So you each have 2 minutes to answer. I'm sorry.
Okay, maybe just on this issue, we'll have several actions on that issue. First is quite classical as communication. We'll have a mass media plan to communicate and also go through social media. We also will act very, very locally because solutions are not to be found only in general and national key punchlines. We also have to find concrete actors on the field. And last thing is we will go through sponsorship by professional categories. For instance, we try to find sponsors or godfathers or whatsoever by the teachers, the firemen, the cookers, the sportsmen, the artists in the cultural world, everywhere to have some relays of our politics, not only remaining at a too high a level. So that's some of the action, of the directions we will be implementing in the plan.
And the EUMC definition?
Sorry?
The working definition of anti-Semitism, is this something you can incorporate in your work? Or you can...
Well, yes, of course. You want me to give my definition? Is it the question, or it would be a bit complex? I think we still have work of explanation on these notions. For instance, in France, there is still an issue among anti-racist associations, for instance, NGOs, sorry, on the legitimacy to distinguish anti-Semitism from racism by and large. But we're, of course, very, very firm and very clear on this principle, and we have to first make it share in France, but also make it share in Europe, because we have some difficulties to make accept by other countries in Europe that there is a specificity of anti-Semitism. So that's an intern debate, and that's also European debate on that point. And that's very, very important. That would be my working definition, recognizing the specificity.
Well, as you might know, Germany has the presidency next year in the OSCE, and I can assure you we will make another effort to do that, because although the OSCE is not an easy organization, since everything works by consensus, and when you come with this working definition of anti-Semitism, then, for instance, Turkey says, what about Islamophobia, and what about this, or particular interests? So it's not easy to comfort every member state, but I can assure you we'll try to do this. The fact, like to handle hate speech in the internet, like child pornography or so, is a very, very good and very credible and very, very good kind of initiative, and politicians work for that. I know that the French government is pushing very hard, and this is part of the fact that we have to put all these internet firms also under pressure, the providers, and pressure there, I think, is the only way to do it. But I absolutely agree with you. Why shouldn't it be possible with hate speech, and not only anti-Semitic hate speech, any kind of hate speech? It's really unacceptable. The last question is of course very complex. As you might know, we had on the 14th of September, next to the Brandenburger Tor, following the incidents also in Germany, a big manifestation. Our politicians were there, parliamentarians, but where were the Germans? We had 5,000 people only there, and where's civil society? It's a very difficult answer, of course. We don't want to have really incidents where Jews are killed, for instance, in Germany. Then I think NGOs would come up, but we need to do something before. And my personal opinion is to try to do it with the so-called soft values and sympathy things Jewish life has. Like I said before, it's a great contribution Jewish life gives to Germany: restaurants, cultural festivals. Also to our Israeli friends, I would also like to suggest that in their public relations campaign, they should also focus on trying to show to the Europeans that Israel is a great country where you can go swimming, where you have cultural things, great music. It's a good place to party, and also for young, these soft values, and not only focusing on the conflict all the time. So sympathy.
Thank you. Ira, last but not least, like Hillel, while on one foot.
Yeah, 1 foot. On terms of this working definition, I'm very happy that Ambassador Klein has said that Germany will take a role, because the OSCE or other institutions in Europe should have this definition, whether it's the exact definition we have but similar, making it clear that certain types of criticisms are illegitimate. Secondly, on the internet, I have been in touch and talking a lot with some of our social media, particularly Facebook, and I think there is an increasing awareness that using terms of service is the way to go, at least on their part, and it's going to we need civil society. They are putting together bureaucracies to police this, but we need civil society to identify the hate pages or the hate sites and work with social media. I think there's an increasing awareness. Won't be easy, but I think we will get there as one method of dealing with the internet. The other of my colleagues have always said, beyond just taking things down, we have to learn how to use the internet, use social media as the pushback, as to use the positive speech on there. Finally, on the issue that Jane brought up of taking this culture of speaking out, I want to say that this was not always the case in the United States. 60 years ago, we did not have the culture. And I talked to a young Swedish girl who is fighting anti-Semitism on Malmo today. She came visit us at the State Department after we visited her in Malmo. And she and her parents said, in Sweden, we don't want to speak up. I mean, the culture is not to speak up. It's to say it only behind closed doors. This 17-year-old is willing to break that culture, and we're just going to have to, it starts with political leaders speaking out, as we had like in France and Germany. That's the start. But the culture can be changed, and I'm convinced of it. Finally, I'll add one other thing. Changing around organization charts in and of itself is not going to address anti-Semitism. But certainly at the EU level and at the country level, as Germany's already doing, having one specific official in charge of anti-Semitism, not just anti-Semitism, racism, though they have much commonality, they have major distinctions. Having both at the country level, but particularly at the EU level, an office to do this is something the U.S. would like to see, and at least Ukraine has already said they will do that.
Great. Thanks to, first, the panelists. Thanks for the good suggestions. We hope lots of people hear the suggestion about an EU official, an office, among other good ideas that I think just came out of this panel. Thanks to all of you for coming and for listening, and hopefully you got a lot of new ideas to take into your work in Parliament, in diplomacy, in NGOs, in civil society. And please contact anyone at AJC so that we can help in any way we can. Refer to our call for action. Refer to us. Use us as resources, as experts. And we're happy to link you to one another so you can use each other as resources and experts. Thanks as well to my colleague, Daniel Schwamenthal, well, to all my colleagues, but also particularly to Daniel Schwamenthal, head of the Transatlantic Institute here in Brussels, who has a few last words.
Thank you very much, Deidre. And at the risk of sounding like a cheesy entertainer, I have to reiterate Deidre's remarks. You were a terrific audience. I've never seen this in 11 years in Brussels. To have such a big group of people staying here for such a long time at a conference that is not exactly an easy topic. I want to thank our speakers, Commissioner Jourova and Deputy Prime Minister Yambon, and all our fantastic panelists, my colleagues in Europe, in New York, in Washington, all of whom came here to make this happen. As you see, we are invested in Europe. We will be ready to be your partners, to remain your partners. Seek us out, whether you are here in Brussels, in Paris, Berlin, or Rome. I want to say special thank you to our leadership, to our president, Dan Berkman, and 4 lay leaders who made it here today, to be with us here today: Harriet Schleifer, Cindy Masters, Mary Goldman, and Marian Berkman. Thank you all for being here. If you want to hear David again, next month we have the Global Forum in Washington. I'm not saying this because I work for this organization. It's really a terrific event. There are flyers out there, fantastic speeches, fantastic panels, interesting discussions. But I'll stop here now and wish you all a great day. We have lunch for you outside. Please stay if you can, and let's continue this conversation. See you soon.